As the Money Burns is an original podcast by Nikki Woodard. Based on historical research, this is a deep exploration into what happened to a set of actual heirs and heiresses to some of America's most famous fortunes when the Great Depression hits. Each episode has 3 primary sections. Section 1 is a narrative story. Section 2 goes deeper into the historical facts. Section 3 focuses on contemporary, emotional, and personal connections. Story recap. While Jakey Astor and Alfie Vanderbilt both turned 21, Wooly Donahue is the first to be officially engaged. Now back to As the Money Burns. Plucked. Another day, another danger, as an heiress finds herself in double trouble. But a minor medical emergency is nothing compared to the tax man. Section 1. Story. Money always comes with lots of attention. The littlest things get noticed and amplified. So what happens when bigger things come into focus? Nothing catches more attention than a sudden unexpected visit to the hospital. Monday, September 23rd, 1933, Manhattan. Word from St. Luke's Hospital, tall, no longer awkward young heiress Doris Duke is recovering from a minor operation. Her socially ambitious mother, Nanaline, meets briefly with the press and states, "It was just a simple tonsil operation. Doris is feeling fine and will leave the hospital tomorrow." The devoted mother has been a daily visitor at her daughter's bedside. But with all the recent precautionary measures instituted after Doris received kidnapping threats this last summer, it seems odd to publicly announce her location or plans. Yet the press reports her whereabouts over something as trivial as having her tonsils plucked. More dreadful, along with this news, the press likes to remind everyone that Doris might have inherited nearly $100 million, close to $2.14 billion in 2025, upon the death of her father, James Buchanan Buck Duke, in 1925. Now the latter, the amount of inheritance, becomes an even bigger focus. There is always speculation on one's net worth, and rarely would the actual amount be available for public record. However, the young Miss Duke might have a circumstance really exposing at least a portion of her fortune to the public, a lawsuit with none other than the IRS. Her father, Buck Duke, most adamantly did not like the introduction of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, later renamed the Internal Revenue Service, back in 1913. No sooner than it had formed, the first targets are naturally the robber barons from the Gilded Age with their vast fortunes. In fact, the first richest list is essentially compiled to assess taxation back to then as number 1, John D. Rockefeller, number 2, Andrew Carnegie, number 3, J.P. Morgan, number 4, Vincent Astor, and only a little further down the list, number 9, Buck Duke. Thus, the public fascination with millionaires is born. Of course, no man of industry would willingly give up his money, much less if he questioned the government spending. Buck is aware that the temporary taxation on personal income will likely be extended indefinitely, as it would create a breeder bureaucracy of an ever-growing government. Rumors circulate that Buck is considering becoming a tax exile, buying a peerage, and potentially giving up his American citizenship, especially after renting a London home in 1914. But Buck returns with the outbreak of World War I. By the end of the war in 1917, Buck sets up 2 trusts where the beneficiaries are solely his daughter Doris and himself, depending on who survives the other. These are intended to circumvent that tax system and any future changes that might become more egregious. Nearly 7 years later, Buck is right as the tax laws change again, and a new set of taxes are levied in 1924. Thus, the next year, around the time of his death, Buck astutely reassesses and transfers his remaining estate into multiple trusts that will go primarily to the Duke Foundation and his only child, Doris. This move also thwarts his second wife Nanaline's greedy intent to give the Duke fortune over to her oldest non-Duke son, Walker Inman, from her first marriage. Only at the reading of the will are Buck's final changes revealed. This tax case is not the first lawsuit Doris has fought over her fortune. An earlier one being against her own mother when Nanaline tried to divest the estate of certain properties which Doris associates with her beloved father. In 1925, Buck dies, leaving behind an estate of $101,606,000, today $1.82 billion. A tax case will arise claiming that there is a deficiency in collecting taxes for that tax year on the original 1917 trust. The trust and disputes are reportedly worth $30,364,000. The 2025 estimate value is essentially $544 million if dated to 1925, or $723 million if dated to 1933. The IRS seeks to collect taxes and interest from back then totaling $9 million, which would be $217 million today. There have been several attempts to collect this amount. In the meantime, the circuit court from the tax board refuses to place a levy on the estate until the dispute is resolved. The arguments are over Buck's intention of the original trust and thus when they would have become activated, or hence taxable. Within the trust, there are strict conditions that the trust revert to Doris upon his death or back to him if Doris precedes him in death. The argument lies within, are the trusts active as of 1917 when created or upon the death of Buck or Doris? A circular argument for sure. However, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue is trying to claim that the trust would have been activated upon Buck's death in 1925, thus must be taxed at the increased Revenue Act of 1924 rate versus on the date of 1917 when no such taxes could be levied. The Commissioner's claim has been denied and appealed multiple times to the Board of Tax Appeals and the Third Circuit Court of Tax Appeals. As Doris is not 21 for another few weeks until November 1933, her trusts are overseen by executors including Nanaline, Buck's business associate George Allen, and attorney William Perkins. As far back as July 1931, Doris has won each attempt and appeal. However, Uncle Sam is unwilling to forfeit such a large amount and thus tries again to overthrow that ruling. Then in spring 1933, the Supreme Court announces the few select cases it will review this year, and Doris's tax case is one of them. Monday, October 23, 1933. Nearly 8 years after Buck's death on October 10, 1925, the Supreme Court rules against the additional taxation. The vote is 4-4, with Chief Justice Hughes not participating in the final vote. While that would appear to be a tie, a majority vote is needed to overthrow a lower circuit ruling, which in this case had favored Doris. Hence, by default, Doris finally wins the matter once and for all. Buck would have been so proud of his daughter's steely might in enduring this endless battle. Not only is it her win, but a victory for many who fear the increasing taxation that is occurring under the new Franklin Roosevelt administration. Had Buck lived, he most certainly would have shared the views of his contemporaries towards the increasing federal government. Among them, J.P. Morgan Jr. is a vocal opponent of taxation and a target for tax review. Another tax opponent, the highest taxpayer in Philadelphia and potential dodger, financier E.T. Stotesbury, takes note. The formidable Doris is impressive. Not only does she have a vast fortune, but the strength to defend it, and relatively so unfrivolous in her lifestyle choices. If only she could become his daughter-in-law through stepson James H.R. Cromwell, aka Jimmy. E.T. has over-pampered those around him, especially his much younger wife, Eva Stotesbury, and by extension, her children. All those that depend on E.T. are unaware of his rapidly dwindling fortune. Dwindling? More like evaporating. He has no intention of letting the IRS eat his estate and plans to spend every penny before his own death. E.T. also takes a more hostile view towards his stepson Jimmy and his affiliation with Roosevelt and the New Deal. Buck, too, would not have liked Jimmy's politics and financial proposals. Regardless of the temporary victory, the perpetual attention on Doris and her fortune makes her a target of envy, greed, and kidnapping. Some might try to woo her, others appeal to her sympathies, while a select few would willingly take more criminal measures to acquire a fraction of her gold. Nothing is more certain than death and taxes, though it looks like the latter for once could be circumvented. The former, not so much a concern, at least this time. Section 2: History and Historiography. Oh, here we go again. In 2024, the returning, newly elected, and recently sworn in 47th President, Donald Trump, is going in reverse of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Trump has publicly vowed to reduce spending and cut taxes, including reducing IRS agents. Trump also is trying to return to the use of tariffs as funding for the government. This takes us back to the world before 1913, when the 16th Amendment passes and forms the Bureau of Internal Revenue, which is renamed the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, in 1953. Episode 29, Taxman Cometh, covers the formation and early history of the Internal Revenue Service and taxation on personal incomes. Other episodes have also referenced different aspects of taxation, like Ferdinand Pecora's investigation into Wall Street, which among the discoveries is that J.P. Morgan Jr. paid no taxes in 1931 or 1932. Tax evader and eventual prisoner Al Capone periodically crosses our tails. Before the 16th Amendment, the government was funded through tariffs and sales tax, of which the latter before 1913 provided 90% of the overall income involving items like tobacco and alcohol. Prohibition definitely impeded that source of income. While Doris Duke won the current fight over taxation of her estate, it will certainly not be her last. Another round will come again during World War II, as well as future issues here and there, even going as far as after her own death and estate disputes. For our story purpose, there is one concerning note I want to point out: the constant and perpetual reference and speculation to Doris Duke's actual fortune, even in relation to an article on something trivial like her tonsillectomy. Really, the need to constantly mention her financial net worth does not always feel relevant or safe for that matter. Just to reiterate, for articles relating to the tonsil surgery, the amount mentioned is $100 million, which would be $2.14 billion in 2025. And for those involving her tax case at the Supreme Court, the two trusts are estimated to be valued around $30 million in 1933, which would be $723 million in 2025. The earlier $544 million value based on a 1925 conversion rate. Furthermore, both situations are not mentioned in her 5 biographies. Only the dispute and concern Buck Duke had over the incorporation of the federal income tax and him prepping the original trust and estates. Nothing is mentioned on the later court case Doris would face in the 1930s or her brief hospital visit. Granted, her biographies cover her very long and active life, but still, little big things fall through the cracks, especially when they're not as seemingly juicy as some other topics. Now, as I peruse trying to get information on both those situations, I run into another story which I will visit at a later time in the very near future. One that illuminates a common description of Doris by her older half-brother Walker Inman that has never been given a date or time, but now has suddenly popped up clearly within my research and can now be further contextualized. Trust me, we will visit this soon enough. Long before I began this podcast, I outlined the main story structure with key moments. What were all the main turning points, setbacks, highlights, and events across multiple characters' lives? This way I knew where to aim and what to watch out for when digging for more story. However, I knew if this became the intended goal of a television series, many details would be combined, ignored, or lost to fit the needs and restraints of a production budget and limitations. Due to a different set of concerns, I also stayed away from the visible and financial limitations of making this immediate series a traditional documentary, which would quickly become too restricted by needing correct or relevant images and the expense of licensing them. But when I finally chose to start the podcast, I knew I could fully flesh out any and all details on that journey. Verbal storytelling gives way more latitude to any person, any item, any time, any place, the ability to jump around the globe or time period within a paragraph. I could give more and more because I myself always like and want more. A concrete journey and destination, but a very luscious and winding path. Many seeds planted that keep blooming and harvesting over time. Then last year, in early 2024, I began finding completely new stories I have never seen referenced anywhere in all this by now over a decade of research. This new information is still completely relevant and actually fleshes out what was known, and even better, confirms what might have been postulated or speculated, as in the potential Mdivani interest in Doris Duke as a potential mate. Unfortunately, this last year has been a little harder for me to keep up with the intended schedule for new episodes. Most dominant are ongoing tech issues, and other complications have delayed the output more and more over the last 2 years. By the way, except for archival music provided by Past Perfect, I do everything by myself. This has forced me to reevaluate a few things. Primarily, I need to break away from the parallel time story structure, which has been in place since the second year. As in their winter during our current winter, holidays like Christmas or New Year's in tandem. Over the last year, this has caused me anxiety in trying to keep speed while telling the full story. Ironically, this is a good complication. My problem is that the influx of articles and focus on the wealthy during the Great Depression has increased significantly in their contemporaneous press coverage, and thus I am finding more and more information. I am a person committed to telling as much of these stories as possible. Only I've been forcing too much into a single episode, causing bloat and longer episodes, which feeds into the anxiety caused by the tech issues with more to manage in an edit. Therefore, I want to slim down and refocus episodes to the intended shorter, tighter, and more anecdotal situations with proper overlaps when possible. I love character crossovers, intersections, and parallels. While this means the current production year might end a few episodes shy of the typical 26 by the 6th anniversary mark, yes, we are getting to 6 whole years. This change might well mean there will be far more story to tell in the long run. I still have the definitive chronological date for the story crescendo. Somehow, something that seemed would be somewhat limited is instead becoming a richer and more vivid story while further highlighting and elaborating the themes and concerns of those whose stories we are revealing. The new stuff is really interesting and missing from other modern sources. So we are getting new, juicy details, long lost in history, rediscovered, and resurfaced. I hope you enjoy what I uncover and reveal next. There are several main storylines with their own plot twists and characters. There are overlaps and parallels. There are multiple segues that seem like detours that truly come back into the larger story. Doris Duke's tiny taxation fight is just one example. I know, not immediately compelling to a story about fortune and romance, but oddly enough, it is indeed another layer into the larger plot. Don't worry, I have plenty of other new embellishments that get more directly into scandals and heartbreak to be revealed. The next several episodes are going to get quite bumpy and oh, so delicious. Section 3, Contemporary and Personal Relevance. I know, it seems hard to have empathy for the rich. However, there are circumstances when it is important to remember we are all human and not be completely cut off to another's pain. I mean, look at all that's happened since the recent Los Angeles fires. I myself got sucked in for a few days watching so much go up in flames. Familiar places, former spots I would hang out after hiking, now all gone. Watching the world change in an instant into an apocalyptic inferno. So much reactions going about with blame and malice, even to those expressing empathy. As the Greek philosopher Heraclitus states, our envy always lasts longer than the happiness of those we envy. If empathy is hard in the immediate, it is definitely harder in the past for those already dead and mostly forgotten. Yet we can still go back and relate. As I have mentioned previously, the three main life events in my youth were: first, my parents' divorce; second, IRS tax audit; and third, the death of my brother to cancer. The audit began before the separation, but it was losing the actual house that was the traumatizing event for my brother and me. Now, Doris Duke never suffered the fear we had in losing our home, and in a time with little financial options. Still, many people had no idea what was happening in my private life. I had switched to public school after the audit began, and I was regularly reminded to be prepared to come home and find sales tags on everything. Such was the stress for 2.5 years, when the sale happened overnight without us being warned. On the outside, we looked fairly well off. On the inside, everything was nightmarishly falling apart. Recently, I made mention of the loss to a group of my high school and college classmates and friends. One adamantly stated the IRS cannot take your home. There are rules against that. Um, this all happened before I met them, over 30-something years ago. I corrected him sternly. They did effing take my house. Glad to know they may have changed the rules since then, but for damn well sure, it happened. He apologized and agreed it must have really sucked. My life has always had the anxiety around taxes. My dad stressed for years. My eldest brother, a construction worker who barely made $20,000 most years, was audited at least 3 times. So yeah, I can get that even if Doris can pay, the anger and stress of the intense pressure when the IRS comes knocking. I do have one note of levity. I got one of those random phishing calls saying the IRS was coming to swarm my house for unpaid taxes. The message went to voicemail. When I told my boyfriend at the time, who happened to be my tax accountant, he tried to console me not to worry. Please. I know full well what happens in an audit, and I know damn well sure they ain't storming like that, especially over nothing. Unless you're Ahmet Taibbi, and that's a completely different matter. The loss of our home, along with several deaths, makes me empathetic to any circumstance where someone loses someone or something beloved. Sudden reversal of fortune into the bad. The fact that Doris went through any of it makes me relate to her and wanting to make sure to include that particular detail in her life experiences. While she might not have suffered the loss, it still came with a very public disclosure that could have negative consequences on her safety. The public announcement of such an astronomical sum is frightening. And by the way, Doris is deeply tied to the Carolinas, so those affected by Hurricane Helene would have definitely had her sympathies. She was secretly someone who donated much to those in need. We don't have to dismiss things as rich people's problems. Sometimes problems are just problems, and every human being deserves some empathy in measure. A callous disregard makes life more dangerous, not better, and it never improves the life of the bitter person. Sort of like drinking poison, wishing another falls ill. 2025 has definitely started off quite tumultuously, but hopefully you have had some beautiful moments, and eventually, one way or another, history has proven these times too shall pass, and there will be better days one day in the future. Despite their fortunes, our heirs and heiresses have bumpier roads ahead of them, so stay tuned. I love hearing from listeners, and I'm curious to know what you enjoy and relate to. Come check out As the Money Burns through Instagram and X to answer some fun poll questions. If you enjoy As the Money Burns, then please share, like, and subscribe. Next, when we return to As the Money Burns, Some weddings might be grand, but nothing catches more attention than a good divorce scandal. Until then. As the Money Burns is an original podcast written, produced, and voiced by Nikki Woodard, based on historical research. Archival music has been provided by Past Perfect Vintage Music. Check out their website at www.pastperfect.com. Please come visit us at As the Money Burns via GoodPods X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, now Meta, or Instagram. Transcripts, timeline, episode guide, and character bios are available at asthemoneyburns.com.